we get into it, we do have some disclaimers. Hello, Glovin. Hello, everybody else who has popped in. First disclaimer, you may notice that for the first time in a long time, we have a content warning on the channel today. We will be reading Rider at the Gate by C.J. Cherryh, and it is not meant for children. Underline not. I read it at the young age of 14. This was a mistake perpetrated by my father, who forgot just how, I'll just say it, horny this book can get. Okay? He did not remember that. All he remembered was that it was a science fiction novel that he enjoyed when he was in college. And there was a certain point in my family, I've said this before, where, because we were homeschooled, so they had us at home all day. And my parents just had to start throwing books at us in order to keep us back. You know, they were huddled in the corner, and they were just throwing books, trying to keep us occupied and not inventing flamethrowers, which is something we did. So my dad eventually broke a box open of his old college novels and threw them at us. And it was some of the classic sci-fi stuff. My dad was a nerd. Orson Scott Card, of course, in that mix, Frank Herbert, and a lot of stuff you've never heard of before that is long out of print. This is one of those books. The portrait that we have up today is actually the cover of the book. It's Rider at the Gate. And from what so I did a bunch of research into this one, because this is not in open copyright. Like, it is not public source, whatever the proper frickin' word is. I know this word. It's not open source. It's, what's a word? There's a word here. I know it. I know this word. Creative Commons. It's not in the Creative Commons. All rights are reserved by the author. The thing is, and this is going to sound a little sad, I'm not sure if she's alive. I did a bunch of digging because I wanted to try and reach out and contact her and get permission for this. So I did a whole bunch of digging, and what it came down to was I found her website where she was selling off old author copies of her books. And I found her social medias that had not been posted on since I think like 2015. Basically, she's disappeared from the internet, which, you know, would that it were so for all of us. Internet's not a good place to be. But and she's very, very elderly at this point, from what I can tell. She is a lady of some age. So I am not exactly sure if she is still alive, which is, it sounds horrible to say, and I hate that I say that, but from my internet sleuthing, I can't tell. And I did reach out to an email that was available on her website. It bounced back as an invalid email. So I have no idea. I have no way of contacting the author to ask for permission. So what we're going to say is this: all rights reserved. Consider this a fan audiobook project. All right, but I really wanted to bring you guys this book because it's a book I truly love. It was a very formative book for me when I was in my teen years. And again, not a book for teenagers, but it was a very formative book for me, and one that I still have a lot of love for. And I haven't gotten to read it in over a decade since, I was in college, I wasn't at home, et cetera, and then I moved away from home. I just haven't read it in a long time, and I really wanted to read it. So I went out. The internet is amazing at this. I found a copy, and we are going to read it today. If you want a brief description of the book, I don't have the back of the book, but I do have my own recollection of it. It is a story about a group of alien colonists, human colonists on an alien planet, I should say, who have made peculiar bonds with local wildlife in order to survive extremely harsh conditions. And it's kind of devolved them into a Western kind of society. Cowboys, sharpshooters, that kind of thing, on these cold, frigid mountains that are near impossible to get through sometimes, and where the wildlife is incredibly hard to navigate. So It's just a dangerous thing filled with cowboys and space horses. I really can't pitch it better than that. It's cowboys with space horses, and it's really, really cool. At least I loved it when I was younger, and hopefully, I'm a little scared. I will admit, I'm a little scared that we get into this book, and like 2 chapters in, I realize it's not as good as I remember. Which of course will happen because age and memory. But I am convinced it is a technically proficient book, even if I may not like it as an adult. But it is, this was a really important work for me when I was a kid, and I wanted to bring it to you guys. So again, I do not own this. Consider this a fan audiobook project. If the author or anyone representing the author would like to reach out and have me take these down, absolutely, it is your right, and I'm not offended at all. All right, but I would hope that if she ever saw this, she would appreciate that someone appreciates her work like this. From what I can see of her catalog, she wrote an awful lot and never really found critical acclaim, which I think is criminal because she has some of the best ideas in science fiction, especially pairing science fiction with other genres. I find Cherry to be extremely novel in that sense. Not all of them land, of course. You write a bunch, not all of it's going to land. But I think Rider at the Gate does land in a really cool way by marrying science fiction to cowboys in a way that doesn't feel forced. It really doesn't. It feels like a logical extension of the sci-fi universe she has created for these books. It is a duology. If this one does well enough, I'll bring you Cloud's Rider, which is the second book. I think it was originally intended to be a trilogy. The second book ends on a heartbreaking cliffhanger that I would love to see expanded on. But alas, I think that time has come and gone. So, without further ado, I believe it is time to get into the book. We start where most things start, at Chapter 1. The first of the truck convoy had scarcely topped the rise that would lead them down to Shamasy Town when 3 riders broke free of its line and raced up on a gust of autumn wind, past the bell arch of Shamasy Camp, and through the open gates behind which over 1,000 riders and night horses were encamped. These 3, strangers all to Shamasy, swept into the camp commons without any more warning than that, borderers by their dress and manner, atop night horses out of the high wild. 2 of them stopped just inside the gate, while the 3rd rode down the main street of the camp, searching. They were a grayness to night horse minds, these 3 from the convoy. 2 out of range, the 3rd a shifting flutter of images passed to nearby horses, and from them to the Shamasy riders' minds. An uneasy sending that masked the pair's intent from the night horses, who held no secrets one from the other. But it required no night horse sense to know that these 3 wanted something. More specifically, they wanted someone. A scattered few Shamasy riders, camp boss Lyle Wesson among them, hearing the disturbance among the horses, deserted their tables in the gate tavern and gathered on the encircling porch. Lyle Wesson walked alone down the wooden steps and stood in that dusty tavern yard to meet that 3rd rider. This guide and guard, he perceived so on the whisper of information coming to him from the horses, to a line of trucks now rolling unescorted towards Shamasy. Unwise to leave a convoy unattended, even within sight of Shamasy, largest and most secure of all the Finisterre towns. If they had done that, it was a breach of procedures for which these 3 might pay dearly in subsequent hires. But as the rider from the convoy drew up near them in the tavern yard, Lyle Wesson and all the nearby riders saw, imaged in their own minds through the stranger's horse, the blond young man the convoy's guide had come looking for. More, the Shamasy riders felt a terror closely held under the stranger's facade of calm, terror and a gnawing insanity under which these 3 riders had labored for days. "Stewart's the name you want," the camp boss said aloud, more than uneasy at the prospect of that unsettled sending set loose through his camp. "He's somewhere about. Get down. We'll stand you and your mates a drink. Someone'll find him. The stranger shook his head. Not here, he said, scantly controlled, and leaned heavily on his horse's withers. Tell him. Outside. The night horse under him threw its head, shook out its black, cloudy mane, and with no more decision of the rider, those around him were in a position to know, it spun and fled back towards the two riders who waited at the gate. Those two turned beforehand and dashed beneath the bell arch and out onto the road. The third followed them at no less speed. The riders and their camp boss, who had most immediately felt the fear unraveling the peace, breathed a collective sigh of relief at having that much space between Shamousy and the madness those stranger riders carried with them. Find Giles Stewart. The word went out. The boss spoke aloud to the riders he sent on that job, a message without night horse image. It was a human attempt to control that madness. But a solitary night horse, in the hostile, curious way of its kind, had come near enough to skim the image-rich surface of human thoughts, had gone off, unknown to the camp boss, to carry what it learned to its den mates. So the contagion spread, inevitably, through the encampment. It took a man of considerable walk to accomplish the circuit of Shamousy Camp, that protective circle of riders and horses who lived between the double palisade walls of Shamousy Town's perimeter. Riders who slept in hostels near the horse dens, met in taverns similar to the Gate Tavern, and lived in their separate settlements within that ring. But that image had made the rounds of the Bell Gate section of the rider camp and was traveling down the ring road to the next station before the camp boss had even climbed the steps to the Gate Tavern. The image had reached the fourth tavern and cluster of hostels long before the bell rang that signaled the arrival of the convoy at Shamousy Town gates. It was a smallish, blond man the stranger wanted, a young man, a borderer, the rider of the horse that imaged himself as fire, pain, and dark. Those who knew Stewart called the creature Burn. The image mutated and acquired opinion as it sped further. A solitary young man, a sullen, prankish horse, both prone to fights, a pair that roused dislike in some quarters of the camp and respect in others. Disdain among the Shamousy riders, which image held more of Shamousy opinion of borderers in general than of Stewart in particular. As a result of those acquired opinions, it might have been 4 and 5 different men the message sought before the image was halfway through the 5th cluster of brown plank buildings. Night horse sendings were like that when they flew through a camp. They were images and emotions, no words. Sometimes a rider or a horse mistook the individual in the message and shaped the image to something more like someone he did know, an image that also passed on, confounding the search. Sometimes it found no names in human minds, and sometimes it acquired others, mistaken names as it met the leading edge of the spoken rumor. But the main thread, Camp Boss Lyle Wesson's order, running by human word of mouth at various distances behind the night horse sendings, held no doubt at all. Giles Stewart and the night horse Burn were the rider and the horse the strangers wanted at the bell gate. They were present in camp. There was danger in the high hills, and arriving with a truck convoy, some businesses had come to the gate that strangers who knew Stewart had feared to bring inside the walls. Only prudent hesitation where so many night horses were gathered. Bad business, bad news. A contagion that no one in his right mind would want to receive. In the better part of Shamousy Town, the very core of Shamousy, where wealthy wooden houses were bright, with painted flowers and red and blue eaves, where gas lights glowed wanton waste on the street corners even at early twilight. No one had even noticed the event, except that the bell had rung which signaled a convoy coming in. Merchants left their dinner tables and headed out for the marketplace, as late as it was, to spy out what goods had come in and with what prices. Well-dressed children ran out to see the trucks and annoy the drivers. Others in the town turned out for curiosity, if nothing else. The better part of Shamousy Town would never feel the fear and distress that ran the circuit of the rider camp. But that was, after all, why the rich built their houses so far from the palisade walls, so that the riders and the world over the hills would never intrude into their peaceful lives. That insulation was the privilege of their wealth, which they gathered from their labor and their trade, and which they planned to enjoy forever, nothing changing, preferring to build atop each other rather than the crowd closer to the camps. But in Shamousy slums, the insulating ring of human squalor lying between Shamousy town and Shamousy camp, where the bell meant little but rich merchants getting richer, the residents sensed that night horse rumor like a presentiment of storm. It was a sensation so convincing that some stopped their business on the streets, and others flung up their windows to search the skies in the west, the ordinary direction of bad weather. But when the western heavens showed clear in the final glow of sunset, the slum folk directed their anxiousness instead down their streets of ramshackle, unpainted board buildings, towards the encircling walls of the rider camp. And with the helplessness of the poor who had to live nearest the camp, and the images that seeped through those wooden walls, they cursed and spat for fear of nightmares. The Fisher household felt that storm feeling in their drafty third-floor flat, a flat which lately had new stoppage for those drafts and smelled of fresh paint and plaster. The Fishers paused in their supper and looked towards the window as Danny Fisher's fork hit the plate and flung beans in an arc across the table. "Hail!" Danny cried, which one didn't ever say under his parents' roof. He wasn't thinking clearly as he began to get up. He only realized his intention as he cleared his chair and it scraped on the floor. "Now where do you think you're going?" his father demanded. His mother said, "Danny, sit down. Finish your supper. Bell's none of your concern." But he couldn't sit down. The feeling was dreadful, as if his mind were going every direction at once, and he had to wonder why didn't his family feel anything. His youngest brother, Dennis, shook at his arm, saying, Danny, sit down. What's the matter with you?" His mother was upset now, and his father was angry, ordering him to take his seat with the rest of the family and act like a sane human being. But he had to get to the camp. He had to find Cloud. He headed for the door. His father shoved his chair back too, yelling at him to come back and do as he was told. His father crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise it. Then his mother was on her feet and grabbed at his father's arm. "Let him alone!" his mother yelled. "The boy can act like he's sane. The boy can sit down and finish his supper. We have neighbors." "Fine, we have neighbors. They all know our son's crazy. It's no use to them." "Don't you yell at me. Sit down. Everybody sit down and eat your dinner. I'll throw it out if nobody's going to eat it." Danny didn't feel anything but that disassociation, that terrible coming apart. He jerked at his father's arm. "Let me go, damn it, I've got to go!" His father's hand cracked across his face. His father started yelling at him, something about God and religion, devils and hell. But devils and hell weren't here. Something else was, something as frightening and far more imminent. Danny freed himself, not because his father couldn't have held him, even lately, but because his father had let go in seeming shock, while his mother pounded on his father's arm with her fist, screaming about how that creature, and how it would come into town and they'd all die if he didn't let Danny go to it. Dennis was bawling, screaming at them to stop fighting. His older brother, Sam, stared at all of them from the table. Sam didn't argue with their father. Sam wanted the machine shop when their father was gone. Nothing more, nothing less. So Sam just shoveled down another spoonful of beans. Danny grabbed his coat, his scarf, his hat from the pegs beside the door. "You don't have to come back, you!" his father yelled. "You're damned to hell dealing with that beast, you know that? You're going straight to hell!" "Shut up!" his mother yelled. "You don't mean that! Danny, he doesn't mean that!" "Yes, I mean it!" his father shouted, and the fight was in full cry when Danny shot the bolt back, banged the door open, and raced down the rickety stairs. He was halfway to the bottom 2 steps at a time before Dennis overtook him. Dennis got a grip on his coat, screaming at him to stop. He didn't want him to go. Papa didn't mean it. He couldn't go out there. The devil would get him and drag him, and that horse down to hell if he went back there. Danny wasn't even aware of shaking Dennis off. You just go, he heard Dennis screaming after him. You just go ahead. God's going to send you to hell. Papa said God's going to send you to hell, and I don't care. It was meaningless noise to him. He ran the stairs, rushed out the door, and down the street breathless. People everywhere were stopped, gathered along the walks, looking towards the wooden walls of the camp. He never felt anything the like. It was bad. It promised the town worse dreams, and people shied away from him in the streets, seeing not a kid who'd grown up in their neighborhood, but a rider's fringed leather, a rider's clear purpose in the midst of the stifling storm feeling. Trucks jammed Gate Street, which led down to the Belt Arch, trucks crowding one another, engines growling in their uphill climb towards the market and the warehouses buried deep beneath the town center. Protection for the material wealth and the vital food supplies that were life to everyone, merchant and slum dweller alike. Only the riders could survive without. Riders could survive without the town. The town could never survive without the riders. Tanker trucks lumbered in the midst of the canvas-covered cargo trucks, huge, long rigs the drivers ordinarily chose to park outside the walls. Tonight they were in the line, seeking shelter from the coming dark. Danny wove past the gawkers at the corner. It was a big convoy, maybe the last before the winter closed the passes. "Don't listen!" a street preacher was shouting. "Heed not the beasts! Death and damnation to the followers of the beasts! Pray! Shut your hearts against the creatures of this world, and pray to God for deliverance!" The feeling on Gate Street was overwhelming. Maybe part of it was the exhaust from the trucks. Fumes welled up in the narrow street under a dilapidated overhang of buildings so old and so close that at the gentle imprecisions of the uphill road, the tankers ran their tires up over the low curbs and threatened the eaves with people on the sidewalks. Danny wanted to run. He felt as if he couldn't get enough breath. Diesel stung his eyes and his throat as he walked double time. Terrible thump. Some driver rear-ended the truck in the front. Second collision then as someone else was stopped too short. Panic was contagious. The drivers felt it. "Pray for your children, that they not follow the beasts!" He was strangling in it. Fear raced through the camp, provoking a general surveillance over the main street from the doors of rider hostels and night horse dens alike. The camp boss and the several riders who had first come out to meet the arrivals had set up their own watch over the situation from the vantage of the Gate Tavern porch. Night horses who had drifted into their vicinity had shied off into the twilight, spreading the message that the camp boss was not pleased. The tide of disturbance had rolled all the way through the camp and back again. Constantly now, it imaged a thin, smallish man with fair hair, recognizable to some, not to others. It imaged strangers at the gate, and horror in their company. That image stirred hate in some quarters, and that hate roused other angers waiting to explode, tempers set off by nothing more than the darkness of the feeling. Fights broke out that had nothing remotely to do with Giles Stewart. But it was hate for Giles Stewart that had sent Ansel Harper in particular searching after his cousins, and anger and fear flowed through their meeting at Hammy's Tavern, a bar mostly claimed by the riders of the Hollandslake district. Night horses wandered through the open portico of the tavern, and the feeling in that precinct was not good. Hallandslakers, Harper included, knew Stewart. And unlike most of the other riders in Shaughnessy Camp, Ansel Harper recognized the threat lurking around the edges of the message. He, unlike most riders, had felt it before and never wanted to feel it again. He knew and controlled that knowledge. A man who dealt with night horses learned to keep his past from infecting the present. Night horses didn't think easily in terms of past or of future. A careless rider's own imagination could all too easily become real for his horse, and come from the horse back to him. Stuart hadn't caused what had happened, not directly, as Stuart hadn't caused the newest disaster directly. But that hardly mattered. Giles Stuart was the kind of man trouble always happened to, and there wasn't a friend Stuart had in this Holland Slaker tavern. Not now, and not before some poor sod out there had died with the horror this death had about it. Because that was what lurked at the core and around the edges of the stranger's message. Death. Come singing to as many as wanted to listen. Harper and his associates knocked back 2 rounds of drinks in quick succession, not the only patrons trying to drown out the feeling that pulled at old feuds and sieved up through old matters long settled, even among themselves. Damned fool, Harper said, as the horse-born image made yet another round of the camp. But what he imaged in his own mind was, in particular, a young fool, quick to offense, too quick to pull a knife. Drunk at the time, as Harper himself had been, night camp on the road, hard decisions to be made, and Stuart in no good mood. But neither had Harper or his brother been in a charitable mind towards a sullen outsider. Gary had died years later of something Stuart hadn't had a thing to do with, just as the breaks happened in the high wild. Gary was dead, and Stuart was alive. Nothing to do with each other, those sets of facts, those events that left one man alive, one dead, but it wasn't damned fair in Harper's thinking, and Harper didn't want to see the face that kept intruding into his mind in constant image, preoccupying his attention like an unwelcome waking dream. Most of all, he didn't want to feel what he was feeling in the air. He didn't want that sending that was rubbing in the fact of Stuart's presence in the camp like salt into a wound. Stuart. Damn his trouble-prone, arrogant son-of-a-bitch ways that plowed ahead into a situation when smarter men said, "Stop, don't go." Men and horses had breaking points, and the high wild, when a man or a horse grew careless, always won. Minds snapped, illusions became fact. A man wandered right into his death blithe and believing, until madness sucked his companions down into that delusionary hell with him. So someone else had died. On Stuart's side this time. One of Stuart's friends, most likely. Good riddance. Harper carried a scar across his ribs. Stuart had one to match. So had Gary. Draw it had been then, due to a trucker's interference. Hallen slackers had said no go, and maintained a convoy wasn't safe on the mountain. Holland slackers had had damned good reasons for saying so, including the higher fees they ought to have gotten for doing it. But Stuart, the only outside rider the convoy had hired on, he'd pushed claim, of course they could make it, and he'd bring them through. For no extra charge, as if money didn't matter. And Stuart, of course, had gotten his way being far more palatable to the trucker boss. So it was go on up the road at the same fee, despite the risk, or lose their reputation and look like cowards to the clients. 2 Hallen slackers had died on that haul, swept away down the mountain, thanks to a snapped cable and toppling truck that had nearly taken Jerry out as well. Knocked cold he'd been by that free-flying cable that had taken Jerry's partner down. Stuart in the number of the dead? The man whose stupid, stubborn fault it was that they were there with that faulty cable, that unstable truck? No such luck. And Gary hadn't fought Stuart again. Gary hadn't fought much of anything after that trip, not even after his cracked head healed. Gary was never the same after that. Gary had taken hires he shouldn't have taken, loaned it across the mountain in a season he shouldn't have. Gary's sense was gone thanks to that cable, and Gary's heart had gone, swept down the mountainside with his partner. And that was that. A brother couldn't hold him. A brother couldn't stop the change in him. Gary'd been on his own when he died. He'd chosen that, as others who lost partners chose to die. He'd written out to his death. His horse? They'd had to shoot it when it came to camp without him. They had no choice. They'd been lucky. For a moment it had been sane. The feeling in the camp grew darker and more angry. Night horse politics, sexual politics that shivered on the autumn wind. Death. Sex and death and a rider Stuart knew and slept with. Harper had his night with him. He knew where Stuart was now, disquieting feeling. He knew that the ripple of query had just gotten to Stuart. Stuart knew that the ripple came racing back again through night horse minds and human, a feeling like the pause between lightning and the thunder. The camp boss watched from the gate tavern porch as Giles Stuart came walking towards the camp gate, following that reverse tide of rumor. Slight, smallish, dressed in brown fringed leathers, the reality behind the image. Stuart's long blonde hair was loose, a borderer's vanity, and he carried knives, one in the boot and one on the hip. That was a manner, as the saying had it, a definite manner which gave not a damn about the rules of no conflict that prevailed in a camp this size, a manner that flatly challenged the camp boss to call him on it. But say that Stuart wasn't the only one, and that Stuart carried at least two of his in the open. A clear warning. Say that the camp couldn't enforce the rule. There were riders, especially borderers like Stuart, who had specific reason to guard their backs, generally against other borderers. Borderers, the wild rider guides born to the high wild, were the ones who knew the routes at the extreme points of settled land. They were a necessary fact of rider society. They stayed in Shaughnessy camp only during the winters, when the routes were closed to trucks and riders alike. And Shaughnessy locals, the guards over cattle and town edges, hadn't the knowledge the borderers had of each other. No one local knew who was right and who was wrong in their quarrels. Out in the far land where civilized law didn't apply and where those knives settled grievances. So Lyle Wesson, sipping a slow, speculative pint on the porch of the Gate Tavern, kept entirely out of it, not seeing anything in his venue in question. Borderer business. Borderers looking for each other, carrying bad news was what Wesson picked up. He couldn't identify some of the other feelings he was getting on the backwash out of the further camp. He didn't like much of what he could identify, so he kept a purely human ear to the matter, awaiting human specifics. More than an ear, Dart Old himself limping a little. It was arthritis in the hindquarters, an affliction they shared with the winter nip in the air. Left the comfort of the night horse den nearest the tavern to stand watch over the commons, too. And as Stuart approached, on foot, Dart imaged, and something so unquiet it shivered along the nerves. "Man's walking," Indeli said, moving out of the doorway to stand at Wesson's elbow. "He's being followed." "A man can't help that," Indeli said. Truth. That Stuart chose to walk and not ride gave Wesson, who disliked and distrusted borderers in general, a better opinion of him. Stuart, for his part, had meant to keep it a human matter. But a living darkness trailed Stuart as he passed them without a word, heading for the three strangers waiting for him just outside the gate. It trailed Stuart through the gathering dusk, regardless of Stuart's intentions. A head-down, angry darkness, with which no rider would be willing to argue. Stuart's horse, defensive, outraged. Dart flung out a feeling of ill and warning, protecting the porch from that outrage, and trotted across the street, positioning himself between his rider and the source of that dark anger. Opinion all along the street solidified around that pair as they passed through the gates and the stranger's message reached its target. No question now. Rogue was the word on the wind. That was how humans called it. What Night Horse's image was something rolling and dark, and that was what Wesson perceived in Dart's image. Rogue horse, at least. That impression came through the horses, and maybe, far worse news, rogue rider somewhere out in the bush. He didn't know where now that image was coming from. It had no direction, but it was spreading like wildfire, and even the image was deadly dangerous. It was more than imagination what night horses shared with human interlopers. Insanity came quite naturally in this season of mating and rivalry. So did death. There began now to be another presence in the uneasy flux of images. A young red-haired woman, a borderer, on a night horse that imaged itself as no qualifier, just the bright and largest moon. Abby Dale, Indelia whispered, and Dart's presence carried a gut-deep certainty of the woman's death, and a landscape so real, so particular in detail, that Wesson would have swore he'd been there. "She's dead," Indelia said. "A fall on the rocks. She was with the convoy. She died." More riders gathered. Soft movement on the boards of the porch. Images proliferated. Rocks running with blood. On that instant, young Danny Fisher came skidding in, shied off from the man at the gate, and darted distracted along the palisade wall looking for his horse. Wesson could guess, among the night horses that maintained an uneasy vigil at the den near the gate. Wesson caught and held his breath until the fool kid was clear of the situation. Town kid. Shamusy kid. If the boy had fallen afoul of Stewart, it would have been his business. And Wesson was, personally, very glad it wasn't. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Already, I hope you're getting a feeling for why I love this book. And this author, in fact. I just love Cherry's work in general. The sense of foreboding is so well carried in this chapter. It's amazing to me. It's absolutely fantastic. Like that's a chapter that grips you, and it tells you a lot without telling you anything. We know that these horses, these night horses, these alien horses, are somehow psychic, that they bond with certain people, and not everyone gets the same bond. That there's a range to their psychic abilities that's not too big, but when they group together is very large, and that they can, through this psychic power, unintentionally influence their riders and other people to a lesser degree. We know a lot about the politics of the situation. Shamusy is a mountain town. It's about to become winter. This is their last convoy. We know of a border area from which lawless men come, who are very necessary to everything, but unfortunately necessary because they are lawless. You learn a lot without learning a lot, and it might feel like fire hose at first, but all of that's necessary to understand anything in the story. That was a fantastic first chapter. I mean, that, like, maybe it was a bit much. Maybe it could have been spread out a bit more. But if that doesn't explain how, like, I write and how I spread information, I try to tell you nothing while telling you everything. A lot of showing, no telling. No telling happened here. There was no sentence that said, night horses are psychic. Nowhere did they say that. But you come away with that very clear idea because it's all showing, no telling. The only time they tell you something is to interpret the night horse images because the night horses aren't quite smart enough to send the right thing. And that just makes you feel like you kind of are in the same place as everybody else in the story. You're in the same place as the writers when you do that. Because the writers are having to interpret what they're seeing. We're having to interpret it too. So already I feel like I'm on the same page as these people, so to speak. I feel like I'm in the room, right? I'm getting added in, like I'm speculating alongside them. It's just such a good chapter. Like, that's a very strong first chapter. We'll get into chapter 2 here in a second.